So today I'll present briefly to you about microcredit groups and Gram Sabhas, which are village forums, and we're going to try to think of these institutions through the lens of sustainability, which was a very interesting exercise for me to do as well as I was putting this presentation together. So first of all, it raises a set of very fundamental issues regarding conceptual clarity. First of all, as was mentioned right at the beginning, when we think of the term sustainability, conventionally, we think of it in reference to the environment, climate, where we are basically referring to a manner of using resources without damaging or depleting. But broadening up the notion of sustainability, we also often hear of financial sustainability, especially anyone interested or working on an issue like microcredit will have definitely come across the term financial sustainability. Now, what does financial sustainability mean? So usually it refers to the question of, is an intervention capable of self-generating its funds to cover cost and capital requirements? So here we're talking about lending capital, so that there is no longer any requirement to depend on external aid or subsidy. Then we can also sort of extend the notion to think about social sustainability, which was mentioned a while back. And that could mean something like, maintaining social systems over long periods of time. Now here there's a very interesting issue. If you think about it, historically we can think of plenty of examples of very unequal social systems, very oppressive social systems, which have also survived for very long periods of time. And that forces us to make a distinction between the concept of social sustainability and equality and equity, which directly goes to the core of fairness and justice. So we really need to be conceptually clear about what kind of sustainability we are referring to, especially in reference to human, social and economic interventions, and what are the trade-offs in pursuing each kind of sustainability. So the two kinds of development interventions I will be talking about today is first microcredit. So these are programs which offer collateral-free lending, so collateral-free loans. You don't have to put in any material collateral to get loans, small amounts of money usually. And also there is a component of small savings. Usually we find these in developing countries, but also in poor communities in the US right now, in Eastern European countries, in China. So it's really become a global phenomenon. And the idea behind is to enhance the livelihoods of poor. And since more than 90% of the frontline clientele are women, because microcredit is explicitly targeted to women, there's a lot of discourse and an effort, or claims rather, that microcredit also facilitates women's empowerment. And especially the microcredit programs that I studied, it's very interesting that CARE was mentioned here, and I didn't know about this collaboration, but CARE was a major player in the microcredit programs in India, which I studied. So that's an interesting connection right there. Then Gram Sabhas, or village forums, these were constitutionally mandated as part of the village self-governance initiative which the Indian government took in the 90s. So these are basically sort of, the kind of town hall meetings you see happening in the US. So these are village-based forums that are supposed to happen 2 to 4 times a year, where a variety of local level development issues are discussed and deliberated. So these are spaces then where governments, where state officials, the government and citizens interact directly about issues which are very pertinent to their everyday lives. Okay. So a little bit about microcredit now. Also, going back to the issue of expansion and sustainability, microcredit mostly started during the 70s and 90s as a non-profit effort in Bangladesh by the Grameen Bank, and also parallel in Latin America with Acción and Compartamos. Then, given the success of microcredit, and success, of course, in the initial years was defined by the exceptionally high loan repayment rate. So people were really wowed that people in poor communities had sort of 95, 98% loan repayment rates, even where interests were quite high. That led to the worldwide expansion of microcredit in the decade between the 90s and 2000. And finally, given the success meaning here loan repayment success, that enticed the commercial banks to get into the business of microcredit, and there was a move towards commercialization of microcredit. So the institutional forms really began to multiply. So initially you had microcredit groups, sort of group-based lending, and that moved to a more individual-based targeting of loan clients. From group participation, you had direct transaction, and there's also been a recent move from productive investments to consumer credit. And finally, in 2009 and 11, there was somewhat of a crisis both in a particular state in India and Bangladesh surrounding microcredit activities. So that gives you a landscape of what happens to human interventions when they sort of seed out, start off, gain a lot of success and popularity. There's worldwide diffusion, institutional forms multiply, and often things get complicated. Okay, so here is a slide about that, but what I really want to talk about a little bit is the institutional diversity we see in microcredit, and this ties back to the issue of financial sustainability and the trade-offs with that. So on the one hand, we have a non-profit model of microcredit, which are often these days termed self-help groups. These are basically microcredit groups. For these, the loan capital usually comes in the forms of grants and subsidies, could be from the World Bank, from national governments, national banks, organizations like CARE, etc. Non-profit doesn't mean that they're interest-free loans. Interest is charged usually at sort of 2 or 3%, but at a flat rate. So when you calculate it on an APR basis, it usually comes out to 12 to 14% APR interest. Usually NGOs are the biggest implementers, and these microcredit programs tend to be group-based. On the other hand, you have for-profit microcredits, which are much more recent. These are commercial microcredit programs. Here, the lending capital usually comes initially from some kind of an angel investor who starts it off, and then with the commercialized companies, they actually float shares in the stock market, and private investors buy those shares, just like you would buy any shares, and the interest that is generated from the ground up then goes back into the pockets of these private investors as returns on their investment. So what happens to the interest money that's generated is very different between the nonprofit and the for-profit model. And this is the one that is sort of touted or claimed to be financially self-sustainable because, of course, it doesn't depend on external aid or subsidy. So a lot of microcredit proponents, or at least the commercial ones, argue that this is the model that microcredit in general should be moving to. Okay. So these are some summary statistics to give you a sense of the scale of microcredit in India, but all of these numbers would be very high if we had a complete database. This database only includes information from self-reported information from only 158 MFIs. It does not include the most sort of the largest state-operated microcredit programs, but it shows you the enormity of the scale of microcredit programs. And India is just one example. As I said, it has global spread at the moment. So how do we think of microcredit sociologically? And this ties into why it's important to think about it from a perspective of sustainability as well. So on the one hand, a lot has been said about how microcredit thrives on relationships of kinship and residential neighborhood relationships, because there's a lot of informal monitoring going on, which lends to the very high repayment rates. But also we need to ask ourselves, when people are embedded in these economic relationships, do these relationships then get imbued with some kind of a social meaning? It's also important for us to think of this from a social capital perspective. Simply speaking, we can think of social capital as things like trust, the capacity that women have to cooperate among themselves to achieve sort of common goals or common goods. So it's an interesting question to think that you put women together into these group-based networks. Does that affect trust between them, societal trust, their capacity to cooperate to achieve public goods or other kinds of benefits? And that certainly, again, ties into the issue of sustainability, equity, etc. Then there could be also implications for social norms, right? So for instance, do microcredit groups play any role in influencing social norms at the village level, at the grassroots level? Do they gain the capacity to change norms which depress women's welfare? And finally, group behavior and collective action. So you have these hundreds and hundreds of microcredit groups at the village level. How are these groups behaving as a collective? Is economic cooperation spilling over into social cooperation, into other issues? Okay. So this is basically what a microcredit group looks like. A group is getting together for a meeting. Again, the basic idea is social collateral. These are neighborhood-based groups. Women evaluate each other's sort of loan and repayment capacity and decide on who should get how much loans. There is peer monitoring, and these group meetings happen 2 to 4 times a month. So I'll show you some visuals of microcredit groups meeting, so you have a sense of what I'm talking about. All right. So, of course, economists and anthropologists have done a lot of research on this. Of course, mostly economists have been interested in the poverty impacts of microcredit, not so much on the women's empowerment impact, which was my interest. But a few economists who have looked at those have found sort of positive things to say about it. Very interesting, anthropologists have looked at the same microcredit programs and most of these in Bangladesh actually, and have found the exact opposite things, where they have had extremely negative things to say about microcredit. So I find that enormously fascinating. You would think that focusing on the same sort of cultural and country context would control for differences, but the findings are enormously different, which kind of piqued my interest on this issue. So I began thinking of this issue as, so you have a microcredit group, but you really have two mechanisms which could potentially contribute to women's agency. One is the economic mechanism, which you'll get from the program literature, that you give women loans, they become entrepreneurs, they have income, they gain bargaining capacity within the household, and that's how they gain empowerment. But there's another sociological sort of intuition that tells you that there could be another mechanism, which I just call the associational mechanism. The fact that you put women together in these groups and realize that in many of these societies, the only relation that women have are kinship-based relations, marriage-based relations. They are in sort of patriarchal societies where after marriage, women go and settle in the village of their husbands, and they're really cut off from any other kinds of networks. So it could mean some monumental, meaningful change that when you're bringing women together, forming them into groups. Also, in many of these societies, institutions in the civic sphere tend to be very male-dominated. So that it's possible that this associational mechanism then could also be having some independent effect on women's empowerment. All right. So this is a general sort of idea of the context which I just told you about. So sort of subsistence cultivation, landless families, or sharecropping, small land holdings, male-dominated public sphere, etc. And the data I'm sort of talking to you from is these 400 semi-structured interviews with microcredit participants. Now, very quickly onto my findings. It's a very crude way of presenting it. But what's interesting here is, first of all, I find that a considerable portion of women actually have a great deal of decision-making authority and agency within their households, mostly because they are female-headed households or a smaller percentage of egalitarian households. The second category is really interesting. I find that a large percentage of women actually gain agency or empowerment from the sociological intuition, which is the associational mechanism, right? Then there are two categories of women where, one say their households have gained financially from microcredit, but they personally have not experienced any empowerment. Then there are women who I sort of classify as losers, that they gain neither financially nor socially. And finally, you have a very small percentage of women who actually gain mechanism through the predicted path of entrepreneurship and income generation and bargaining, right? What we can then do is we can subtract away the women at the top, because let's say their empowerment comes from different household and circumstantial sources. And when you recompute the percentages, we basically have a situation where nearly 50% of women are gaining empowerment from this associational mechanism, which has been completely ignored in prior research, right? So that's a very important finding, which sort of taking a sociological perspective opens up. So when we look at entrepreneurship and bargaining, we see that women who are able to successfully use loans and become independent entrepreneurs, there are certain preconditions which need to be fulfilled, and there are certain factors which favor entrepreneurship, right? And you have all of those up here. Similarly, for women who gain agency from the associational mechanism too, we find that certain preconditions need to be fulfilled, that these group meetings should happen on a regular basis, they should facilitate face-to-face interaction, leadership is strong and dynamic. But at the same time, given that there was quite a large percentage of women who failed to gain agency despite having access to the same mechanism, we find that there are factors suppressing women's participation in these sort of cultural contexts, and most of them relate to the kind of masculinity they encounter in the household, the kind of household structure, cultural opposition, etc. All right. So generally speaking, it's sort of, to present my ideas very briefly, what's really important, what's happening here is women are crossing the boundary from their household into coming together into this group. They're getting socially exposed. They have access to more information via these groups, and they have largely expanded social networks, which is extremely significant. And all of that percolates to sort of enhance their capabilities on these different dimensions. Okay. And this was the most surprising and stunning finding, which was completely unanticipated, was these microcredit groups were engaging themselves in various sorts of collective action and sanctioning at the village level. 30% of the groups that I studied had undertaken various sorts of collective action. And by internal, I mean where groups had acted against or intervened in households that were also group members. External means they intervened in problems of households that were not involved with microcredit groups. And community-wide, of course, these events had community-wide impact. What's most interesting here to see that most of these actions were sort of focused on external, so non-group households, also community-wide impact. So it's not that women were just cooperating for the benefit of each other, of only group members, right? And very significant collective action, many of which had to do with taking action against things that depress women's welfare, like domestic violence featured in a pretty major way in many of these actions. Now, at the end, it's interesting to see how these microcredit groups are growing in political importance in many states which have had microcredit for a long time, right? So these are election time promises by two political leaders. So one leader, and this is a South Indian state where if any of you had South Indian food like dosa, etc., you'll know they need to do a lot of mixing and grinding of pulses and rices. So one political leader says he's going to give women mixers or grinders, and the other political leader comes and says she's going to give them mixers and grinders and fans, and she's also going to introduce three-phase electricity connection across the state in 4 years so they can actually run these implements. And she also says that she's going to give microcredit groups loans up to 10 lakhs with 25% waiver of loans. Okay. So the final thing, again, as I said, the big controversy, the big debate, and the big push now is to push microcredit from these nonprofit models to a financial sustainability model, so a debate between philanthropy versus free market. And it's very interesting, if you look at where the private philanthropic sort of money is going, it's going into this commercialized sector of microcredit. So the Omidyar Tufts Fund, Omidyar, of course, is Pierre Omidyar of eBay, gave Tufts, his institution, $100 million in 2005 to invest in commercialized MFIs in the Balkans, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And Michael and Susan Dell Foundation of Dell Computers gave $27.5 million to MFIs in India. And all of these are commercialized, financially self-sustainable microcredit. Let me move on to the second intervention that I was talking about, which was the village self-governance system and village forums. So these were instituted in the early 90s. So the basic idea was that before then, all the development decisions were very top-down. They came from the center, and then people realized that there should be more sort of inclusion of voices from below for development planning. So at the village level, these bodies were created, and they were made responsible for preparing and implementing development plans, for providing services in areas of health, education, transportation, drinking water supply. They were supposed to impose and collect taxes. And the idea was that this would increase the accountability of politicians and village level bureaucrats. So Gram Sabhas, the village forums, were a part of these. So all the electorate of the village, they were supposed to get together 2 to 4 times a year, decide on the allocation of public goods. So for instance, if the government had given a grant for the laying of 10 kilometers of road, so where exactly should the road be laid in the village, or where should the well be dug, etc. Also beneficiary selection for a ton of private goods and subsidized government goods. So for instance, if the government gives 10 housing grants for poor families, who are the 10 poor families that should get these housing grants? And it was also a deliberative process where people would come together and sort of, discuss and argue about these processes in these spaces. And finally, the function was also of budget monitoring and control, what was happening to the panchayat budgets. There is affirmative action, and so these are now political seats in the panchayat seats where you have elections. So there is caste-based affirmative action. There is also gender-based affirmative action, right? So there has been some official attempt, at least, to make these as sort of inclusive as possible. So as I said, these are held 2 to 4 times a year, and they have all of these functions which relate to development outcomes that affect people's daily lives, their basic needs, so housing, toilets, distribution of agricultural implements, all kinds of government subsidies, and also public services like health, education, etc. Here again are some visuals of these meetings happenings, and look at the contrast, right? We've gone from microcredit groups, which were heavily obviously female dominated in their association. Now I'm showing you visuals of these village councils. You do see women there, but I think the impression that we all come off with is they're all still heavily male dominated. Okay. So finally, I want to conclude with pushing us to think about some broad issues. One is thinking from a sociological, social perspective. I think that we should also focus on institutions, particularly grassroots institutions. We should also focus on strengthening the civic sphere and think of institutions and innovations that increase the voice and public participation, especially by disadvantaged groups. At the same time, we need to be aware of the pitfalls of participatory development. It's all not rosy and good. There's tremendous problems. For instance, elite capture can be a problem. The village might be divided into competing cliques. There might be a whole ton of problems, but still our eyes should be on strengthening civic sphere and on seeing the extent of voice and participation by disadvantaged groups. Finally, when it comes to things like financial sustainability, issues of financial inclusion, democratization of credit, we should also talk and think about the very difficult trade-offs that are involved. For instance, if you think of something like microcredit, it has had tremendous impact in pretty much not routing out village moneylenders, because people still go to them for taking those bigger loans, but they've reduced the importance and sole reliance on moneylenders, so people can very easily access credit. But there could also be negative implications for very easy access to credit, right? So there are trade-offs in this. Similarly, with financial sustainability, yes, you're no longer reliant on sort of grants and subsidies, but it also means commercialized microcredit has far more higher interest than nonprofit microcredit models. And then there's the issue of social sustainability of grassroots institutions. And there, I think, given the conceptual difference between equity concerns and sustainability concerns, I think when thinking of institutions specifically, our focus should be on creating lasting institutions which have intergenerational effects on moving toward equity. Thank you. I think